morning, everyone. Hussein, thank you very much indeed. Anyone like me who's been to one of these UK and a Changing Europe sessions will know how valuable they can be, especially to people like me in the media. And looking at this list of guests that Hussein and Simon have brought together today, this is another fine example. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the invitation. The person sitting next to me will need little introduction. Sir Malcolm Rifkind, former Defence Secretary, former Foreign Secretary. There is nothing that he doesn't know about these European negotiations. He's been there, done it, and he has the scars to prove it, I would imagine. In fact, I was thinking the last time that I came to a session like this with you, Sir Malcolm, it was a wargaming session. Yes, a wargaming session on Brexit that Open Europe had organised, and you made an impassioned defence of the UK staying in a reformed Europe. One of two things have happened since then. I don't think revolvers and big guns were taken out that day, but there were some eminent Europeans there on that occasion, as there are today. So I'm very much looking forward to what you have to say. We've got a packed agenda, 35 minutes. Sir Malcolm's going to speak for 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll open it to the floor for you to ask your questions. So, Sir Malcolm.
Well, thank you very much, Christian. I have to begin with correcting you, at least in one important respect. There is a vast amount. I have not the faintest idea what is happening in these European negotiations at the moment, because, like everyone else, I go by what I occasionally am told, but more often read or hear in the same way as everyone else. Can I, first of all, congratulate the organisers of the conference. I think it's an absolutely marvellous theme that you have chosen. What actually is it that our partners want? I recollect the very first time, many, many years ago, I heard Henry Kissinger speak. It was actually in London in Lancaster House, in the 1980s, I think it was. And he began by saying, when Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden, never to return, as they left the Garden of Eden, Adam turned to Eve and said, you know, my dear, we are living in an age of transition. So this is not exactly the first age of transition. Each time we have some high drama, going back not just a few years, but hundreds of years, thousands of years, everyone thinks, my God, this has got a damnering, this is the end of civilized life as we know it. These things tend to fall into some sort of shape. And if there's anything I know at all about British history, to some degree EU history as well, it is that on whatever the dramas of the problem, we end up, and I choose my words carefully, stumbling into a solution. Because if I have any knowledge of how the EU operates, it's about finding solutions. And that essentially is the UK's approach, and therefore, logically, I was once told logic is the art of going wrong with confidence, so one shouldn't be too certain, but logically that's what ought to be. Now, I said I thought it was a brilliant theme of the conference. What is it exactly the European Union want? Because although the British government has come under a huge amount of stick for not seeming to know what it wants, we're constantly told by Brussels, we don't know what British ministers want, what they've agreed, what they're pressing for, and so forth. The reality, and I'm trying to be genuinely objective, the reality is that however little we know about what the British government want, we know far, far less about what the EU want. We know they want a lot of money. We know they want a deal on citizens' rights. We know that they want a deal, as everyone does, to the Northern Ireland-Irish border solution. Beyond that, we haven't the faintest idea. The United Kingdom has produced various papers, made various speeches on the kind of arrangement it would like with the EU after Brexit, various free trade arrangements, various access to market arrangements, transitional agreements, a whole range of things. Maybe not a huge amount of detail. But what do we know about the EU's position on that, or that of the German government, or the French government, or any of the other major governments in the EU? They haven't said a word. Now, it may surprise you to know I'm not criticizing them for that. If I was them, that's exactly what I'd be doing. Because this is a hugely hard-nosed negotiation. And the reality is, unlike the British government, they're not under any pressure to reveal their negotiating positions, nor are they under any pressure at all to reveal the ultimate compromises, whether on the budget or on other matters that ultimately will have to be made. The British government is not in a different position simply because of pressure from Brussels. As we all know, the British government's under pressure from within the United Kingdom, from Parliament, from the Labour Party, from the public, from the press, from the media, from academics, saying, you know, share with us, what is it you're trying to achieve? What are the details? And by its very nature, in an open democracy, you actually have to reveal some of that. That's why the government has gone probably further than it would like to have gone. It's not like a business negotiation between companies conducted in private rooms with everybody else not terribly interested. So I have considerable sympathy, not just because it's a government of the same colour as myself, but whoever the government had been, that they are forced to negotiate in semi-public when the people they're negotiating with are under no such pressure. And if that's true about the details of what you eventually want, it's hugely more true about the compromises that will have to be made. Now, everybody in this room knows that in any negotiation, not just a diplomatic one, a business negotiation, a private one, you don't get 100% on one side and 0 on the other as the end result. If you're going for 100%, that is in the diplomatic world what is called unconditional surrender. And you send in not your diplomats, but your tanks. And somebody wins and somebody loses. If you're looking for a diplomatic solution, then that involves compromise. And it is the essence, I'm not saying anything people don't actually already know. It is the essence of any situation that you can't reveal in advance your final compromise positions that you may be prepared to live with. Otherwise, you weaken from the very beginning the negotiation you're trying to conduct from your side, whereas the other side have kept all their cards up their sleeve, and you are none the wiser about that. So that has to be borne in mind before people jump to criticism, because I don't actually think it's avoidable in the kind of real situation. Now, what is it that the European Union probably want? What they ideally want is for us to change our mind, and either through a second referendum or in some other way, to end up saying, oh, it's all so ghastly, it's all so terrible, maybe we should not leave at all. Now, I was a Remainer. I voted Remain. When I was Foreign Secretary, I was known, Le Monde described me as a Eurosceptic modéré. I've always been proud of the modéré, bit of the description. But that's ideally what they would like. Is it going to happen? No, it's not. I don't think there's the remotest prospect of going to happen, because I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding, not just in Brussels, but sometimes in the UK, as to what happened. And there's an assumption that referendum result was an aberration, because we didn't expect it. That is true at that moment in time. But somehow it was a complete aberration that it happened at all, and what we looked for is some form of rectifying it. The reality is it was an accident waiting to happen. From the moment we joined the European Union in the 1970s, we were a semi-detached member. We measured our success by what we could opt out of, apart from the internal market, which was a great Thatcher achievement, ironically enough. So not only were we a semi-detached member, but when you think about it, the referendum itself, the campaign on both sides, was overwhelmingly dominated by Eurosceptics, on both sides. There wasn't anyone, apart from the possible exception of Ken Clarke or Michael Heseltine and a few Lib Dems, who were saying Britain should be in the Eurozone, we should have a European army, we should have more integration. Nobody was arguing that on either side of the argument. Not just because it might have been tactically unwise, but because virtually no one on either side of the argument believed it. So it wasn't just those who were campaigning for Brexit who were Eurosceptic. It was people like myself, and virtually the whole of the government, and possibly quite a number of the people in this room, who say, oh no, we don't want to join the Eurozone. Oh, good Lord, no. European army, that's crazy. United States of Europe, one day, no, forget it. No, it was people who, like me, said, not crazy about this whole project, but on balance, I think we achieve more than we lose, and we've got the opt-outs we need. And therefore, we might as well stay in. Not just might as well, I firmly believed that we should stay in. I still believe it would have been the best result. And those and others who said, look, this is all phony. The person who summed up perfectly why actually the UK ultimately was going to have a referendum at some time, even if perhaps not a year or so ago, and probably one day leave, was General de Gaulle. Let me remind you what he said when he vetoed us way back in 1963. Perfect. He said England. He should have said the United Kingdom, but let's forgive him for that. England, in effect, is insular. She is maritime. She is linked through her exchanges, her markets, her supply lines to the most diverse and often the most distant countries. She pursues essentially industrial and commercial activities and only slightly agricultural ones. She has in all her doings very marked and very original habits and traditions. In short, de Gaulle said, the nature, the structure, the very situation that are England's differ profoundly from those of the Continentals. Very wise. It sounds very contemporary. And when you think about it, what needs to be perhaps better understood both here and on the continent is why, when there are Eurosceptics throughout Europe, as we have seen, why is it in Britain it's led them to the conclusion that we should leave the EU when it doesn't seem to lead to that conclusion elsewhere? And it's essentially because we've been an incredibly lucky country. For most of the European Union, being in the EU has been an insurance policy. They've either had communism for half of the last century, or fascism, or Nazism, or the Greek colonels, or Franco, or Salazar, or occupation during the war. Their democracies, their rule of law, through no fault of their own, is fragile. And being part of an EU that requires you to respect the rule of law and democracy is an insurance policy. So very few people think of exiting. In Britain's case, we haven't been invaded for 1,000 years. Our rule of law hasn't been interrupted since Oliver Cromwell. And therefore, the sharing of sovereignty that's required does not seem so obvious. So I think that is a final point before I make a couple of other points, and then we lead to discussion. The speeches that we've heard recently have confirmed the judgment that most people in Britain had come to. I'm not just thinking of Mr. Juncker, who you might have expected, but Macron. He's the new force in European politics. And his whole commitment is to more and more integration. Integration is good automatically. You don't have to, whereas the British view has always been, prove to us that it will be of benefit to our security or our prosperity or our quality of life. Then, as with the internal market, we'll go along with it. But otherwise, we would prefer to be a self-governing country. So that's important. Now, next point I want to make is this question about, is no deal better than a bad deal? And I freely acknowledge that the phrasing could have been better, wiser when it was first issued. But fundamentally, the point being made has to be right. Again, I come back to the point, both tactically and strategically. The European Union has to understand you can't start a negotiation by saying whatever you end up offering us, we'll sign. Because whatever you offer us is better than no deal. What a lousy way to conduct a negotiation in any walk of life. So the question is, well, do you mean it? Because obviously you can't contemplate no deal unless it might be an option. Now, I have no hesitation in saying it would be incredibly damaging to have no deal. I think it would be a terrible outcome for the Europeans as well as for continentals as well as for us, but even more for us than for them. However, and there is a big however, there is a limit to what any democratically elected prime minister can deliver. And that's, I think, so far as we can tell, what Theresa May was saying to her colleagues in Brussels yesterday. I have to sell whatever deal we have to the British Parliament, to the British public. Otherwise, it just won't happen. But the fact that she doesn't have a majority in Parliament is probably almost an advantage in that particular context. So, if you say it's 60 billion pounds or euros you have to give us, not a penny less, and if you don't agree to that, there's no deal. My personal view would be with a deep sense of foreboding, there would be no deal. Not just as a political decision, but because the Parliament and the public would not permit it to go forward. So the European Union, negotiators and the governments have to be understanding that. They do understand it, I have no doubt about it. But sometime in the next couple of months, by the December summit, there has to be a coming together. Now, a couple of other short points. I think there will be a deal. I don't just want there to be one, I actually believe there will be a deal. And it ultimately comes down to whether it's the mutual interest. And there is a deal in any negotiation when both sides have leverage. Now, the leverage is not equal. The EU has far more leverage than we have, for all the reasons this audience will be familiar with. But where we do have strength, and it's important to them, is first of all the budget. It's not surprising they're attaching such importance to that. At the moment, our net contribution each year, in the last few years, has been about 8.6, net contribution, 8.6 billion pounds. So if the government at the moment is offering 20 billion, that is very serious money. And if either that sum or even a slightly higher sum was rejected by the EU and there was no deal, that would be a massive hole in their budget of a very serious kind. The final point I want to make is that why I think there will be a deal, I think what has transformed the prospects for one is the British government's conclusion that we need and want to have a transitional agreement for 2 to 3 years. Why is that fundamental? Firstly, it relieves some of the pressure on the timescale, that while we are still going to leave the EU in 2019, if there is a transitional agreement that has been made, then it won't matter so much that we haven't dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's on a whole range of issues. We're not under the same pressure we would have been if it was you either agree on everything or nothing by the cliff edge of 2019. If there's to be a transition agreement, a lot of that detail, if we've reached a broad agreement, there will be sufficient goodwill to work on the detail over the subsequent 2 to 3 years. But there's another reason, perhaps even more important in terms of the current crisis, and that is the transition agreement provides a basis on which the British Prime Minister can offer significantly more money than would otherwise be politically possible or economically sensible. Because if we are going to have a significant number of the benefits of EU membership after we've left the EU for 2 to 3 years, there is no dispute that you have to pay your whack, your contribution to the cost of that. That's perfectly reasonable and entirely appropriate. So that, I think, is very important. Very, very final point, linked to what I've just been saying. The EU cannot logically, I know logic is not everything, but cannot logically maintain this position. We're not going to talk about trade or transition until you agree the budget and agree the other preconditions. It's become absurd because, for example, how can you reach a conclusion on the details of the relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic and what will happen at the border if you don't know whether there's going to be a customs agreement, an internal market agreement, or what is the agreement that is going to be the long-term relation? You can't reach a decision on that until there has been negotiation, at least to some degree, on these issues. And likewise, how can you decide what an appropriate additional contribution to the budget might be to cover the benefits you are receiving if you now want a 2 to 3 year transition agreement, if we haven't even begun to discuss what will be the nature of that transition agreement, what will be the benefits you are continuing to enjoy, as well as those that you have foregone during that period. So this is not just a bit of rhetoric. It goes to the core of common sense. And I'm not pretending that Merkel or Macron or Barnier don't understand that. They understand that perfectly well. They agree with that perfectly well. This is all about who blinks first over the next few weeks and the degree to which they blink. And that's going to be up to the diplomats and the prime ministers and the heads of government between now and December, because December is the crunch, not this week. December is the crunch, and it's the final crunch, because if you don't do some sort of deal then you really do force yourself into a position where the time has run out to have sensible negotiations for the remaining period.
Sir Malcolm, thank you very much.